Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with those of you who will watch this recording. What I want to do is take about 20 minutes to describe the work of the Global Education Innovation Initiative, which I lead. And this is a research and practice collaborative that has the goal of understanding how it is that public education systems can be transformed to make sure that students have the opportunity to develop the competencies they will need to be architects of their own lives in the 21st century. And the basic premise of our work is that largely as a result of the development of technology, the requirements for participation, economic, social, and political participation have increased. Just to put that in perspective, in the United States, there are about 6 million people whose job it is to drive these very large trucks that transport goods from one part of the United States to the other. And artificial intelligence is very rapidly going to produce trucks that can drive themselves, that can be driven by algorithms, by computer programs, which means that 6 million people will have to find a different way to earn a living. That's just one example. And so essentially the question then for public education systems is, what does it mean to provide an education that allows people in this rapidly uncertain, volatile world to have the capacities to participate and to have the capacities to live good lives? So the Global Education Initiative, it has essentially three pillars. We carry out our work in three pillars. Our goals, as I mentioned, are to understand how leaders and practitioners in education systems can define and practice teaching and learning that is relevant to the 21st century. And this is an adaptive challenge because it requires understanding how it is that broad social trends um, impact the kinds of skills that we need. It also requires figuring out how to change schools and large school systems, and it requires understanding how to translate knowledge about what change is necessary into policies and programs. So basically, this is about connecting new ideas about how students learn and the kind of teaching and learning that is necessary, ideas about what kind of factors can support those conditions, so the domain of policy and management, and lastly, ideas about what conditions sustain existing systems, which is the topic of leadership. So our work at the moment is focused on the countries that you have on the screen: Brazil, Chile, China, Colombia, India, Japan, Mexico, Russia, and the United States. And as I mentioned, we carry out our work on three pillars. We have, on the one hand, let me just see if I can use the marker here. On the one hand, we have research. We conduct research. On the other hand, we conduct informed dialogues. I'll be saying more about that. And lastly, we develop practical tools to translate the ideas from research into change practices and programs and policies. So on the research side, we have conducted two major studies. The first was a study that synthesized existing research evidence on what are the capacities that allow people to live good lives. And this study synthesized those capacities, developed taxonomy with it, and then examined the national curriculum frameworks of 6 countries. And that study, which was published 2 years ago, this book was immediately translated into Spanish, into Portuguese, and into Chinese. And in the cases of the Spanish and Portuguese edition, they have been heavily used by those leading education curriculum reforms in Mexico and in Brazil. The second study that we have conducted, well, let me say a word about this particular study. This study essentially examines a broad range of skills and looks at the power of the curriculum as an avenue, as a tool, as an instrument to help realign what education systems do. This slide has a synthesis of the curriculum of Singapore. Singapore is an interesting nation because it's a nation that doesn't really have natural resources. And as a result of that, it decided 50 years ago that the way in which they were going to become a viable society, in fact, a thriving society, would be creating a society governed by the rule of law, same law for everybody, and building the talent of every person. It's a small country of about 4 million people, and they say we don't have any mind to spare. We cannot spare any mind, and therefore we have to educate everyone. And it's interesting that in the last iteration of the curriculum in Singapore, the last iteration, this slide synthesizes what they did, which was to place values at the center. Place values at the center on the recognition that no society can function if there isn't a common framework, ethical framework that provides the social glue to bring the society together. And then in the outer ring, you have these core capacities that are basically about character, the capacity for self-awareness, to manage oneself, social awareness, manage relationships, and making responsible decisions. And the idea is that these ethical core and these intrapersonal skills will then produce individuals with civic literacy, global awareness, cross-cultural skills, critical and inventive thinking, and then communication, collaboration, and information skills, which will in turn produce a confident person, self-directed learner, concerned citizen, and an active contributor. Notice how different this proposition is from most curricula, at least that I'm aware of, that emphasize knowledge and the transmission of knowledge, or at best, critical reasoning skills and critical thinking in using knowledge to solve problems. But for the most part, curriculum which do not include these capacities to govern oneself and to work with other people. So the second major study that we have completed, which will also be published by Harvard Education Press in English in the summer of 2018, so in a couple of months, and which I hope will also be translated and published in other languages, is a study of programs of in-service teacher preparation that build the capacities of teachers to educate the whole child, to educate, to cultivate these cognitive skills, these self-management skills, and these relationship skills. And what is interesting about, I'll just share a few highlights of that study, but what is interesting about this study is how remarkably similar these very high quality programs in 8 countries, as different to each other as Singapore, China, India, Colombia, Mexico, Chile, and the United States, in spite of the differences across those contexts, the very high quality effective programs share the following characteristics. They all reflect the conception of adult learning that sees learning as socially situated, and it has to respond to what teachers need, as opposed to many programs of professional development where a group of people far away from the school decide what it is that teachers should learn. Now, these programs help teachers develop the capacities to address the needs they have identified and influences not only the capacities of individuals, but of teams of people within the school. So in many ways, the conception of learning that guides this program is one of building the institution, helping to change the pedagogical culture of the organization of the school. It's not just about helping individuals build capacities. The second characteristic that these programs in these 8 countries share is that for the most part, they are not the kind of short-term program of one lecture, 2-day institutes, or something where teachers are pulled out of the school and they go and hopefully become inspired by what they hear. Instead, these are multi-year programs, often 3 to 5 years, where the professional development involves not individuals, but teams in the schools. And the modalities of development are multiple. They include study groups, they include action research, they include developing portfolios, they include getting the teachers to investigate some questions that interest them. Third characteristic is that they build, oh, this is the one that I just mentioned, I'm sorry. Third characteristic are these extensive opportunities for teachers to build capacities using, and also to help progress in trajectories of professional development. This professional development emphasizes not only the transmission of knowledge, not only the development of cognitive skills, but also the development of self-knowledge and the development of leadership skills and capacity to work with others and to influence others. So it's a curriculum that is broad in its goals, it's comprehensive, and it includes many things, including visible routines, protocols, assessment systems, and so on. So that's the first set of activities that we carry out research. The second set of things that we do are called informed dialogues. And informed dialogues builds on a theory which I developed with my former colleague Noel McGinn that basically recognizes that getting people to act on new ideas requires that we engineer, that we organize, that we architect the context for them to connect the problems that they care about with those new ideas. And you can find the book. By the way, I forgot to mention that I will be referencing a few books throughout my talk, and you can download many of them in the following website. If you just give me a second, I'm just going to provide a link on the chat here so you can all access it when you're ready. Oops, I now just lost the screen. Interesting. Hmm. Well, oh, here you are. So I'm pasting here. There you go. On the chat room, I have pasted a website where you can find a number of documents. And the document that I'm describing is called Informed Dialogue. And the Spanish edition of that book is available here. The English edition you can find on Amazon. Basically, this theory explains how it is that one can help groups learn together and develop a shared vision, an ambitious vision of education that is informed by research. So we have conducted a number of informed dialogues. One of them was a dialogue that involved leaders of teacher education in the state of Massachusetts that we took together to the country of Singapore to study how that nation had aligned its teacher preparation system on behalf of a very ambitious vision of 21st century education. And we distilled the lessons from that trip in this book titled 15 Letters on Education in Singapore, which was translated to Spanish and published in a Spanish edition by the Fondo de Cultura Económica. The second informed dialogue was one where we brought together a range of practitioners and education leaders to discuss what are the barriers to bring some of these ambitious education reforms that intend to expand the goals of the curriculum to scale. Uh, Part of what we have learned in our research is that there are very many examples, good examples of what I would call holistic education, whole child education, an education that combines cognitive, social, emotional development, but on a small scale. But there are not as very many examples of similar reforms that succeed in scaling to all schools, to all children. And so these informed dialogue grapple with the question of what are the barriers to scale and what can be done to scale these reforms. And that book has been translated and published not only in English, but also in Spanish and in Portuguese as well. One of the tools that we developed is a very simple protocol, which you can find on this website that I mentioned, called Connecting the Dots to Build the Future Teaching and Learning. And what this protocol provides is a very simple guide, a tool that would help a team interested in aligning the various components of the process of teacher preparation on behalf of a new vision of education for the 21st century. And so the basic steps, which are described in great detail in this publication are, well, step one is it's very important to build an ambitious narrative about why improving teaching quality should be a national priority. The second step is to examine the existing system of education against that ambitious narrative and ask the question, to what extent are we helping teachers gain the capacities that they would need to educate their students with this breadth of skills? The third step is to develop a coherent strategy and a set of standards that can be achieved for teachers. The fourth step is to empower teachers as professionals, to bring them as partners into this process of leading the transformation of the institutions that educate and support teachers. The fifth step is to ensure that the profession is attractive enough so that the people who want to become teachers are people that have high levels of cognitive skills, of personal ethics, of professional ethics, high levels of self-knowledge and cognitive capacities. The sixth step is to make sure that the initial preparation that teachers receive before obtaining a license to teach is of high quality and also aligned with the vision of 21st century education. This was the component in particular that we went to study in Singapore and which was reflected in the book 15 Letters. And finally, the sixth step is to support developmental trajectories for teachers, understanding that in teaching, as in any demanding profession, people need to be learning all the time. They need to be improving their capacities as the time, as those of you who've signed up for this seminar presumably are doing. The third set of things that we do in the initiative is to develop practical tools to help translate these ideas that emerge from research and these visions that are shaped in informed dialogues into change practice. And I'm going to reference today 4 practical tools that we have developed. They all have the form of curriculum. So the most recent one was just published, in fact, this week. It's a book titled Learning to Collaborate for the Global Common Good. And this is a book that examines the challenges to human rights and to democracy, which are the result of the growth of populist movements around the world. And the question is, what should schools and universities do in response to this challenge so that we protect democracy as a way of life and the fundamental freedoms and human rights which are essential to life in an open society, in a democratic society? And in addition to the discussion of those topics, this book contains a range of curriculum materials that are aligned with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. What those materials have in common is that they all use project-based learning, student-centered learning, active pedagogies to help students engage with complex issues, with issues from the real world, because the basic premise of the work that we're doing is that in order for students to develop an advanced and an ambitious set of capacities, it is important to increase the rigor of the curriculum and of their preparation. There are 2 other related materials, the book Empowering Global Citizens and the book Empowering Students to Improve the World in 60 Lessons, which basically are, this one contains, the first one, 350 lessons aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals to be used in grades from kindergarten to high school. And this one is a simpler version of that, but this Empowering Students to Improve the World in 60 Lessons contains also, as I will describe in a moment, a couple of protocols that can help teams in schools develop a school-wide transformation effort to put in place a more ambitious curriculum. And lastly, this is a book with a series of readings on the connection between education and human rights. All these materials can be obtained, downloaded in the website in ResearchGate, which I mentioned. So let me talk for a second about the World Course. And this book can also be downloaded in a Kindle version. And the Kindle version has about 2,000 hyperlinks to actual curriculum resources that live on the web that can be used. What are the basic organizing principles of this curriculum? Well, the first one is this is outcomes-based. This curriculum begins with the end in mind. It is also, as I mentioned, project-based. It requires learning by doing, active learning. The emphasis is in developing not only knowledge, but skills and attitudes. In every grade, from kindergarten to high school, students are required to work for an extended period in a project that culminates in a capstone, in a major product that they present to the community. There are coherent yearly themes that are examined, and the units are interdisciplinary. This curriculum, of course, includes knowledge and content which are novel relative to what is normally contained in such curriculum. And the purpose of it is to foster agency, the ability and the desire to make a difference, and to cultivate leadership among students. The notion is to help students learn from what works and from what is challenging. It is a curriculum designed to develop an innovative and an entrepreneurial spirit. The parents and members of the community serve as resources. The emphasis is in developing not only analytic capacities, but also problem-solving skills, skills such as curiosity, exploration, observation, analysis, research, writing, presenting, and inventing. The focus are the Sustainable Development Goals and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The curriculum has continuous, ongoing connections between the local community and global affairs. The idea is to engage students with issues that are complex, that are messy, that have no easy answers. It's an age-appropriate curriculum, but it is not infantilizing. In fact, it has high expectations, and the progression in this curriculum goes from the personal and immediate and concrete to more advanced conceptual and abstract understandings. So we basically developed this curriculum over a 2-year period. This is something that I did with several of my graduate students. And initially, we developed this curriculum for use in an elite private school, the Avenue School, that began operations 5 years ago in New York City and which has opened a new campus in the city of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And eventually, they hope to open campuses in other cities around the world. And in 2016, I published this book, made it widely available, and I began to receive feedback. And the feedback I received from most schools was, this is really difficult to do. This curriculum requires a set of capacities that most teachers don't have. It's a very ambitious curriculum. It's a curriculum aimed at cultivating intercultural competency in the intrapersonal, and ethical domains. It covers various domains of knowledge, as you can see on the screen: economics, trade and demography, culture, politics, science, public health, demography, and business. And then it cultivates a range of work and mind habits. I will not spend much time on each one of them, mostly because, as I mentioned, all of this is explained in the book, which is downloadable on the website, which I have highlighted for you. But what I want to talk about is how we pivoted from this very ambitious curriculum, which is certainly not within the reach of most schools that I know, into something simpler, into something that is guided by the same idea, has very similar units, align all of them with, as I mentioned, various sustainable development goals. But we did that in only 5 lessons per grade, from grade 1 to grade 12. And so these are the various grades of the original world course, as it's called. These are the unifying themes that guide that curriculum. So this is the simplification of that process into a book that was published exactly a year ago now. And in the intervening year, that book has been translated into 7 languages, into Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, Portuguese, Turkish, Italian, 6 languages, I guess. And the feedback I have received from this book, in contrast to the previous one, is that this is really accessible. The book contains 3 tools. First is a protocol that helps any teacher understand how to design and adapt a curriculum that is aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. The second tool is a protocol to design a school-wide strategy for global education. I'll be saying more about that in just a moment. And lastly, this book contains an example, a prototype, 5 lessons per grade in each grade from grade 1 to grade 12 that illustrate what does it mean to prepare students to understand the UN Sustainable Development Goals, to care about them, and to address them. Now, one of the tools contained in this curriculum is this very simple 13-step protocol that says, what should a school do in order to prepare itself to begin to teach a more ambitious curriculum? And the reason I want to pause on this is because I think that a lot of the processes of school improvement and professional development neglect curriculum. And my contention is that curriculum redesign and professional development need to go hand in hand. That curriculum is both a way to set a high bar for professional development, but it is also an instrument. The process of developing and implementing a new curriculum is in itself a process of professional development. So what are these 13 steps? They're very, very straightforward and almost self-evident. First one is you need to put a team in charge if you want something to happen in a school. Second, this team needs to develop a long-term vision, study the UN Sustainable Development Goals, study the UN Declaration of Human Rights, study the National Development Plans if they exist, and then spend some time translating that vision into a specific framework of knowledge, skills, and dispositions that graduates need to master, need to have in order to achieve that vision. Once you have that framework, and the two books that I mentioned contain such a framework, then you can audit the existing curriculum. Once the curriculum is audited, you can then design a prototype or adapt the prototype that we're offering. Once that has been done, communicate, communicate, communicate. Translating that vision into implementation is largely an exercise in communication to the various constituencies within the school and with institutions outside the school that interact with that. Communities, local authorities, local employers, local leaders, and so parents. Then once you've done that, it's important to essentially make a decision about what to do in a particular academic year and develop an implementation plan. Next step is to figure out what resources will be necessary to bring this plan forward. Then develop a framework to monitor the implementation. Then put in place a communication strategy. Then figure out what opportunities need to be provided to teachers to improve their skills. Then execute, evaluate, and then this happens in year one. Then evaluate and decide what you're going to do differently in year two. And as you go through the year, evaluate what you're going to be different in year three. So what we have here is a process of continuous and ongoing improvement where every year a community of teachers gets better, builds their expertise. Essentially, any curriculum is a hypothesis, right? If our students build these capacities, then these things will happen in the world. The process I have outlined here is a process that allows for the possibility of testing that hypothesis. A curriculum is also a hypothesis that says if we teach these lessons, students will develop these capacities. And if they develop these capacities, then they will have this kind of impact in the world. Again, this series of iterations are a way for the school to learn, to test those hypotheses. Is it the case that if we engage students in these activities, students will build these capacities? As we evaluate, then we go back and we say, what do we need to do differently? Now, as we use this process of ongoing improvement, not as an isolated school, but with schools connected with other schools that are doing similar things using similar instruments, that basically provides every school in 1 year to gain 6 years of experience every year. And in this way, augment exponentially the possibility of learning from experience and of rapidly developing very innovative curriculum. This is what is called an improvement network, an approach that I have used in building an improvement network in global citizenship education to help students, to help teachers build their capacities to radically transform school to prepare students for the 21st century. I hope you have found this presentation useful. If you're interested in any or some of those ideas, I have other talks easily available online. All you need to do is go in Google, type my name, and either under YouTube or Vimeo, you will find further explanations of this process. I hope you will go online, download these books, and they will be helpful in your own efforts of transforming schools within your area of influence so that all students indeed have the opportunity to build the capacities they need to build to become architects of their own lives and contributing members of the communities of which they are a part. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. I wonder if Maria, Miriam, or Paula, if they have any questions. In the meantime, I want to thank you so much for your presentation. It's really indeed important, this topic, especially I like the part where we talk about the training of teachers and how we see some countries are doing a lot of work towards talent and recruitment. We know that Chile, for example, has been investing a lot on this. And we know as well that República Dominicana, Dominican Republic, has been investing a lot also on the administrative part of schools and making teachers the leaders and the main person for the driving the changes among students and being responsible for other areas than just like teaching, trying to change this style. And being a Brazilian myself, I wonder if you have an idea of how we can actually implement in practical terms, of how long would it take to change the style of teachers and the model of teaching in the schools to have some sort of this plan implemented, because it is a
Well,
big
I
challenge.
think if you have appropriate ways, if you have appropriate ways to support teachers in building these capacities, you can do this rather quickly, following the school improvement approach I have developed. I'll give you an example. I have worked in Brazil for the last 10 years, and I'm quite familiar with the education system in Brazil. As I mentioned, Brazil has just gone through a very significant redesign of the curriculum, and many of the leaders of that process are good colleagues and good friends of mine, and they have used the ideas that we have developed in the initiative. This notion of expanding the breadth of the curriculum is absolutely reflected in Brazil. But let me give you an example of how critical professional development is. So last September, the Avenue School, this elite school that I was mentioning that exists in New York City, which was the first school to implement our curriculum, opened in Sao Paulo. It's an exclusive school, where you might imagine those who attend have parents who are able to pay a lot of money for their kids to go to that school. And at the very same time this was happening, a network of schools called Ensina Brasil that works with very poor children said this curriculum should be available to all children in Brazil, not only to children whose parents can pay $35,000 a year. And they basically studied both curriculums, both books, Empowering Global Citizens and Empowering Students in 60 Lessons. And they said 60 lessons is definitely a lot more accessible for most schools. So they themselves translated this curriculum. The reason that book exists in Portuguese is thanks to Ensina. We built a partnership with this very innovative organization of civil society in Brazil, and they put together a team of teachers with colleagues in other organizations, Cultura Inglesa and others, and in record time, in 2.5 months, they had translated that book into Portuguese. They had tested those lessons. And my understanding is that a number of schools where they operate are currently doing it. So I think the real question is not whether it is possible to transform the curriculum for something more ambitious in a school. It's possible to do that anywhere. The question is what kind of support is necessary to make that possible. And as I have explained in this presentation, I think the answer to that is strategy and professional development. And professional development needs to depend on a network where you have opportunities for people to learn all the time on an ongoing basis over an extended period to learn from one another. The kind of modalities of professional development that are effective, if I may say so, are not seminars of this sort, where people just watch something which may or may not connect with what they're doing. It's a lot more effective when you provide professional development that is situated in the practice that teachers are having and that connects with issues that people care about. So there are very many good things happening in Brazil. As a matter of fact, in many ways, it's a very innovative country in education.
Thank you. It's really good to hear your experience and your point of view on that. Maria is asking if these tools are applicable also to schools with limited resources in rural areas. And
Of course, absolutely. Of course, if you read this curriculum, it doesn't require any particular resources. What it does require is a serious, determined effort on the part of teachers and principals to teach. Now, obviously, if your question is, can you teach this curriculum in a school where teachers have no motivation, low expectations for the students, and they don't show up? No, the answer is no. But there are many teachers who serve disadvantaged kids in rural areas that have very high professional ethics, that are really committed to the mission of educating kids. So this can be taught in any school. It doesn't require any special resources. What it does require is professionalism and a commitment to actually helping students gain the capacities that are going to give them opportunities in life. And I think that the reason I began my conversation with that protocol about how do we build a strong teaching profession is that in many places, that's the first thing we need. We need to build teaching into a profession where people show up and where people have a professional commitment to transforming the lives of the students that they're serving.
Yes, she's also asking if the main audience for the book is policymakers or if it's useful tool for teachers as well.
So of the three books that I have mentioned, they have different audiences. The last set of books that I mentioned, the main audience are teachers. The 60 lessons, these are books for teachers. The first book that I mentioned, the Teaching and Learning for the 21st Century, the main audience really are policymakers and school leaders. But in practice, I have heard from many teachers who have found those ideas useful. But the book is written at a national level of analysis, at a system level. But the books that are curriculum are books designed for teachers. I mean, they contain lesson plans basically.
Great. And she's also asking how can other actors in the education community get involved in building this global citizenship, like actors
There are
such
many,
as
there are many, yeah,
directors?
there are many actors that are currently involved. I mean, as I just mentioned with the example of Ensina Brazil, Ensina is an example of an organization of civil society that builds parcerias, that builds partnerships with the public education system to help improve the relevance and the quality of education. And in Brazil's case, the only reason this curriculum is available to most public schools is thanks to them. Uh, I do a lot of work with organizations of civil society or business associations. There is a whole network of business associations throughout Latin America that are very active in education. And so I think the task of producing significant educational transformation is one that requires collective leadership, that requires collaboration from many different groups in a society. For example, in the United States, a lot of the good work in advancing global citizenship has been initiated by chambers of commerce and by the what are called the World Affairs Councils, which are these voluntary organizations in different major cities that are very interested in the relationships between the United States and the rest of the world, and which understand that it is very important in the 21st century that countries have very positive relations and collaborations with one another. This notion of building walls and isolating a country is an anachronism that is only going to produce poverty and isolation and misery. And so the World Affairs Council in many different cities, in Ohio, for example, has built partnerships with school superintendents to make sure that schools teach American children to become more cosmopolitan, more open minded, that they understand the cultural diversity that exists in their communities as an asset, as a source of strength, as a source of possibility. So this is a field as any other way to improve the relevance of education that obviously requires good collaborations between educators and other members of civil society.
Yes, that is so important. Thank you so much. I'm sure everyone will enjoy the reading and will learn a lot with your ideas and with the research, which is so very timing with what we're living nowadays and building the students to tackle the SDGs. It would be a really positive change in this role if we can form the uh, empowered digital citizenship uh, and new learners. Thank you so much. We are going to
It was a pleasure. Thank you all very much.
thank you. This all
Bye.
recording will be available on the YouTube, and we will share the link with all the participants very soon. Thank you, Professor. Have a
Thank
good
you.
day. Bye bye.
Bye bye.